evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a blustery spring evening. Welcome to the College of Southern Maryland, and welcome to this evening's Connections event featuring Frank X. Walker. A couple quick thank yous, especially to tonight's sponsors, the Charles County Arts Alliance, the Maryland State Arts Council, the African American Heritage Society of Charles County, Inc., and the Diversity Institute at the College of Southern Maryland. Also, a quick thank you to the faculty and staff who work on the Connections team, Rachel Heinhorst, Krista Kais, John Kulikowski, and especially to Neil Dwyer, who does a lot of the grunt work that goes into bringing in exceptional people like our guest tonight. In 1991, when Walker found a definition of Appalachia that essentially wrote him and his heritage out, rendering African Americans in the area invisible, he coined the word Appalachia, a term with which he could reclaim his heritage. Over 40 writers now wear the mantle of Appalachian poets, reminding us that their motto is, or as an aesthetic, as Walker once said in an interview, is, we make the invisible visible. Walker notes in an interview with an artsy independent newspaper out of Louisville that, quote, artists are more important than ever, especially if the media and journalists are being removed from the equation. Who's going to hold up the mirror? Who's going to say the king has no clothes? He goes on to say, I'm claiming 2017 as the year of the arts activist. I think will be important again because of what we have the capacity to provide to people needing something restorative. So we're going to have a really good year. We're going to be in demand. People are going to listen to us. We're going to have an audience, a pulpit. People are going to buy our work and they're going to come out to our shows and dance. I see it as nothing but possibilities. So former Kentucky Poet Laureate Frank X. Walker is a professor in the Department of English and the African American and Africana Studies program at the University of Kentucky. He's also the founding editor of Pluck, the Journal of Appalachian Arts and Culture. A Cave Canem Fellow and co-founder of the Appalachian Poets, he's the author of 8 collections of poetry, including Turn Me Loose, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers, winner of the 2014 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Poetry, Buffalo Dance, The Journey of York, winner of the Lillian Smith Book Award, as well as 2 new collections, The Appalachian Sonnets and About Flight. Walker has lectured, conducted workshops, and read poetry at over 400 national conferences, art centers, and universities across the globe, including in Derry, Northern Ireland, Santiago, Cuba, Shanghai and Beijing, China, Mainz, Germany, Toronto, Canada, New York's Lincoln Center, University of California at Berkeley, Notre Dame, and Appalachian State University. Voted one of the most creative professors in the South, he's the originator of the word Appalachia, as I just noted, and is dedicated to deconstructing and forcing a new definition of what it means to be Appalachian. The Lannan Poetry Fellowship Award recipient has degrees from the University of Kentucky and Spalding University, as well as 3 honorary doctorates from the University of Kentucky, Spalding University, and Transylvania University. Please help me welcome Frank X. Walker to the pulpit now, where not only will he dance, but where there's nothing but possibility.
I'm not sure what you expect. I'm just going to read some poetry. Once you label something a pulpit, that puts a lot of pressure on it. I'm a PK, so I understand what that means. My mother would be excited and proud to even suggest that I was going to be anywhere near a pulpit. She believed herself to be raising a minister, is what she said when I was young. And she came to my very first poetry reading and said, that'll do. So I'm excited that works for her. I'm going to try to share work from multiple collections and hopefully that it'll weave together for you, even though they come from different eras. I'm going to start out with work from Buffalo Dance and When Winter Come, 2 collections that take a different look and presentation at the Lewis and Clark expedition, and then move to Turn Me Loose, which is set in the civil rights era. And I'm hoping that they will hold together because I'm going to focus on the women and the life of the men whom the stories are about. I think that if I added one of the books in the back table that's about African American jockeys in Kentucky, I can still do the same thing. Isaac Murphy, life is kind of hollow if you don't consider the contributions by Lucy, his wife, and his mother, America Burns. But I don't think you have that long tonight, so I'm going to just limit it to these two collections. And if there's time, I want to close with some new work for what most people don't know is a third Lewis and Clark book that's already been purchased and is being made into a feature film that starts shooting this year. So we're very excited about that also. So I'm rambling because people are still coming. I'm trying to let them get seated. I'll take a drink and let the kidnapping begin. For this first poem, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes because the speaker is going to be a gentleman by the name of York, if you're not familiar with him. York was a manservant who accompanied Lewis and Clark on the great expedition to the ocean and back. And if you are familiar with the accounts, it was not just Lewis and Clark, it was 42 people on the expedition. And York not only played a solid part of it, he saved their lives on numerous occasions. And the one thing about York that's clear from the multiple journal entries is that he was a physical specimen that captured everybody's attention, that Native Americans responded to him in a way that treated him almost like a monk or a religious figure. But physically, his descriptions sound like an NFL defensive lineman who's very large but also very mobile and can move and dance and in spite of his large size and amazing strength. There's a lot of conversation about that in the journals. So if you can imagine this gentleman at the ocean after a year and a half on this expedition with all these men, and every night he's watched 5 or 6 people write down every single detail of the journey. They're drawing maps, they're collecting specimens, they're scribbling letters home. And this gentleman is not even literate. He can't write. The most he could do is stare at something a long time and hope to lock it in his mind so that when he gets home that he can talk about it. So we're going to open in that space. Once you close your eyes, I'm going to try to create a voice that I think represents the voice of York. And I'll just move through the poems one at a time without pausing much in between so that you just get to sit there. You don't have to respond in between. And hopefully it'll hold together. And hopefully I haven't said too much. So if you close your eyes, we'll get started. This first poem is called Wind Talker. They're at the ocean, and he's never seen an ocean before. He's never seen fish as big as a whale. Wind Talker. If I could make my words dress their naked selves in blackberry juice, laid down on a piece of bark, sheep, or onion skin like massa do. If I could send a letter home to my wife, floated in the wind, on wings or water, I'd tell her about Katanka and all the wide and high places this side of the big river. How his family, numbering 3 for every star in the sky, look like a force when they graze together, turn into the muddy Missouri when they thunder along faster than any horse, making the grass lay down long after the quiet has returned. How they don't so much as raise a tail when I come round with my woolly head and tobacco skin. Like I'm one of them, making the Arikara and Mandan think me big medicine, Katanka who walk like man. Today, we stood on the edge of all this, looked out at so much water, the mountains we crossed to get here seem a little smaller. As I watch fish the size of cabins dance in the air and splash back in the water like children playing, I think about her And if we gon' ever be free, then I close my eyes and pray that I don't live long enough to see Massa make this ugly too. One of the things that he wrestles with is his illiteracy. In the midst of that wrestling match, he's thrust into a space where the landscape is a main character in the story. God's house. When we first left Kentucky, the trees had commenced to dressing up the fall harvest, and the garden was already full of pumpkins and squash. Master Clark didn't ask me to go on no expedition. He just said, pack, and pointed to the door. So I gather up what little I got, and more than I can carry his, and head off to a sail-bearing keelboat where his friend, Master Lewis, is waiting. That boat was so big you could lay any 10 of the 16 men on board or 8 of me head to toe and still have enough room for the dog. We starts out on the Ohio and swing up the Old Man of Rivers. When we get to the mouth of the dark woman they calls the Big Muddy, we sets up winter camp a good canoe ride from St. Louis. That spring, when the rains come, we cross the Mississippi and commence to climbing the Missouri and float right up through heaven on earth. More sky than I ever seen, rocks as pretty as trees, and game so plentiful they come right down to the riverbank and invites themselves to dinner. Now, I ain't what you would call a scripture quoter, but the first time I seen the waterfall at Missouri, felt the herd of buffalo stampede and looked down from the top of Rock Mountains, it was like church. And where else but God's house can a body servant big as me carry a rifle, a hatchet, and a bone-handled knife so sharp it could peel the black off a lump of coal, and the white man still close his eyes and feel safe at night? This next one, Primer, speaks to his own view of his literacy or lack thereof. The only book we allowed to know is the Bible. Though many a slave been sold south, had fingers chopped off, and worse for the crime of reading and writing, I figures my respect for a good telling come from listening to old York weave his magic at night. Folk hung from our porch like baby possums and lived off the breath he give to every story, no matter how many times they tasted the tale. I learned to appreciate the power of single words, holding a lamp over Master Clark while he studied his brother's letters and struggled with his own returns. Them think all slaves dumb because we can't cipher, but they be surprised how many words we pick up just standing around like trees in a room full of educated men. And I'm going to skip forward to the part, now that hopefully you hear his voice, that launches into the beginning of the relationship he was involved in. He had an enslaved wife who also lived in Louisville, Kentucky, but she was owned by a different family. And there was a tradition among the enslaved that allowed them, the only free time they had off was Sundays and Christmas. So this is called Sundays and Christmas. York is still speaking. I cares plenty for my wife, but I've been told a slave can't truly know love, being as massa and white men's in general have and takes certain privileges with our women. I suspect the deepest hurt in the world be to risk being tied to a woman's hearth than standing on the front porch while the massa part her thighs, knowing that any cry raised is inviting death or worse. But what else but love make you hold that woman even tighter? Try to rock her back to whole long after the tears dry up and the hurt turns the ashes back to flames. It being nighttime and deep into winter, I can think of no other breath I wish to feel and no other whisper I ache to hear. What we allow to feel might not rate as love, but it'd be powerful enough to make you rule the time between visits. So that's kind of an introduction to York's voice and his enslaved wife. And When Winter Come is the sequel to Buffalo Dance, and in as much as The first book is totally in the voice of York. The second book tries to include and respond to the criticism that the women were missing. So at least a dozen of the voices that speak in When Winter Come are all voices of women, including the voice of the river. One of the things that research revealed is that when York was out west, he married the daughter of Chief Red Grizzly, who's a member of the Nez Perce tribe. And I'm going to read some poems that are in her voice that describe a different relationship than he likely had with his enslaved wife. And then read poems that talk about how complicated that is. Like a virgin. This is York speaking first. Grown folk don't walk around on the plantation holding hands, go for canoe rides, or take long walks with each other. My Nez Perce gal was the first woman I choose on my own, and that I didn't have to share with another. I find myself staring into her eyes and smiling, learning my big buffalo self to move like a turtle in her arms. Men in the party think it strange that I not brag about how many ways or how long we ride each other. This way of being with a woman be so new and tender. I close my eyes and feel like a freshborn calf stumbling on weak, wet legs, discovering that it's not the ground that be moving. And this is his Nez Perce wife speaking. I'll read a few of these. This first one is called Art of Seduction. I know a hungry man's eyes can undress a woman from across a smoldering fire because York did it. When I grew warm to his advances, I gave him permission and invited him over without ever opening my mouth. I looked away, then back, then away, then back so slow. When my eyes returned to meet his, it made his nostrils flare, and my heart beat like two drums in my chest. He didn't have a courting flute, so the first music we made between us was a way of looking into each other's eyes and exchanging naked promises so full of heat, passers-by would swear we were already man and wife. His big hands were rough from a life full of hard work, but when they were filled with me, each one became a party of men deep in the wilderness, intent on exploring every mound and knowing all of the hollowed out and sacred places. I'll read another one called Midnight Ride. This next poem, I hope there are no children in here, but I've earned me the distinction of I've been on the banned book list at a series of middle schools in Kentucky. You decide if it really earned it, but this was a poem they really pointed to. Midnight Ride, which is more Marvin Gaye than, Luke Skywalker. Midnight Ride. After the fires die down, a moon full of shine allows us to wander off into the night's arms. Urged on by the river and the night's music, our two quickly become one. Straddled aboard him, a buffalo robe around my shoulders and nothing else, I close my eyes and ride low and close, the way a hunter tracks buffalo in the deep winter snow. Our gentle trot becomes a gallop, and after a good sweat, our gallop becomes a quiet stand. Then we bow our heads and wait for our breaths to catch up. After a quick dip in the cold river, I mount back up for warmth, and we ride slow and long until my legs quiver and York finds the strength to harness himself. When he carries me back home to our mat, folded up in his arms like a child, we lie down in the lap of the night, both empty and full and sleep. See, that wasn't X-rated, was it? It was mature. I'm going to skip ahead. I read the primer from the first book. This is primer 2 that has York continuing to muse about his level of literacy or lack thereof. York. I can read the heart of a woman in her eyes as easy as a lie in a man's face. The direction and power of a storm speaks clearly to me from low-flying bird wings. I can dip my fingers into muddy hoof or toe prints and tell how many or what I'm going to have for dinner. The thickness of a tree bark, walnut holes, and tobacco worms tell me how ugly winter going to be. I knows the seasons like a book. I can read moss, clouds, sunsets, the moon, and a mare's foaling time with a touch. But I would trade all this to know how to scratch out my name as more than an X, to have my stories leap off paper as easy as they roll off my tongue, to listen to my eyes make the words on parchment say, this here man be York. He can come and go as he please, work for himself, own land, learn his books, live and die free. I'm going to make another big leap and skip again to towards the end of this book. York is back home in the same space where his father lives, his mother-in-law, who's not a fan of his, and they all share the same common space in Kentucky. But one of the things that happens is that many of the slaves, fellow enslaved people, don't feel kindly towards York because he lives a different kind of life. Because he's a personal manservant, he dresses better. He travels all the time with his owner. And his language clearly is a little different. But he has a woman waiting for him back at home. And one of the things that we don't know from the research is even what her name is, because after the expedition, the family that owned her moved out of Kentucky, and York never saw her again. So there's kind of a Shakespearean tragedy tied to just his personal love story. But I'm going to pick up where his enslaved wife, who's been waiting for him for this 3 years, welcomes him. But I'll introduce that with York's opinion of their first night together. It's called A Love Supreme. On that first night back, me and her moved like turtles, unwrapping the old, the news, and each other. We outlast the candle and the moon, laughing and talking and crying, then pretends we are earth and sky, hunger and fruit, a black mountain and an all-skin quilt of snow, salty and sticky and wet. We knows all we have is this here, so we unshackle us clothes, become one with the night, and be free. And she speaks about that return of, she approaches it a little bit differently. This is called Say My Name. And it comes out of this research fact that historians don't know her name even today. York's enslaved wife, say my name. Folks around here want to call me auntie, York's old wife, or Master so-and-so's nigger wench, like I ain't got a name of my own. Them don't know how hard it'd be to put aside a little piece of myself that nobody can't never touch but me. A piece big enough to wrestle the long, hard days and keep itself warm at night without a man around. Them don't know what it's like to stand in the dark, night after night, wrapped in that buffalo robe he sent. Look up at the stars and wonder which ones is looking down on him. And believe if something bad happened to him out there, that I would feel it too. When he come home, I don't need him to say he loved me. I don't need him to bring me gifts. I just want him to hold me close, make like he glad to see me, bend down to my ear and whisper my name. One of the things I firmly believe that, without even mentioning it, that she could look him in the eye and know that he'd been with another woman. So this is called Unwelcome Guest, and this is still his enslaved wife speaking. I don't think York knowed I could see her too. The first time was in the corner of his eye while he looked far off but stared at the plate right in front of him. He didn't say nothing about her, but the way his lips turned up at the ends said plenty. Now, I ain't one to sass. His growl helped me to know a slave woman's place. So I sits up all night with both my hands and ears open, waiting to catch her name on his lips. After that, no matter how much talk of grizzlies, buffaloes, big fish, mountains, or oceans, she become all I can see, all I wants to know. It gets so crowded in our little place, I swears, I can almost smell her. And by then, I knows one of us will have to go. Now, she can't just take him to divorce court, but she is not without means. So this is my imagined response to her realizing he may have shared himself with someone else. It's called the sunflower seed oil conjure. First, I get some fresh well water and puts it on the boil. Stirs up a tea brewed from apricot vine, rattlesnake weed, and plenty of honey. Then I sets him down between my knees and with a wooden tooth comb left to me by my mama's mama commences to scratch it at his scalp till his shoulders look covered with snow. Then I fills up my wash tub with boiling water doctored with peppermint root and sets to scrubbing him slow enough for the heat to open his doors. When his body is clean, I starts back to work on his head, busting up a mean suds and using my fingers to walk up and down his scalp till he let loose a low moan and his eyes start to roll around in his head. After I rinses and twists all the force out, I starts back in with warm sunflower seed oil, only this time every finger makes his own little circle while both my hands make bigger ones. And they follow each other from the stiff tree limbs in the back of his neck, cross his crown to his soft spot, while my thumbs dig in slow and deep where the headaches come on. I pours the extra oil into my hands and rub his neck and shoulders down to his ribs and arms. Then, like a turtle dance, I moves back up again. I work slow and hard, and after a while, when I gets all the way to his man sack, he opens his eyes and be glad it's me. I'll let that sink in. And this section, I'm going to close those contributions with poems in both their voices in a section where the titles were taken from wedding vows. And it really tries to interrogate the challenge of having a healthy relationship that qualifies as a marriage inside the institution of slavery, and what the psychological damage is that comes with that when another man can come into your house and remove you to the front porch while they spend time with your wife, and then you return to that space and witness, the aftermath of what essentially was a rape. How do you do that? And it happens over and over and over again. How do you survive that? I don't know, but they did because I'm here. We're here. So this is called To Have and to Hold. This is York's voice. To have and to hold. It do more harm than good to be enslaved and agree to love forever. When there be folks over us with even more power than death to do us part. Being another man's property, all I can promise is when we in the same quarters, no one will hold you closer or with more tenderness than me. If ever I have to choose between another day of service and death, I will always choose living. Even if master sell me down the Mississippi tomorrow or pair me up with another woman to breed, I only think on what we had and chase away thoughts of what we had not. I aim to see you every Sunday and Christmas, but if ever I'm away more than 2 whole seasons without sending back word, untie the ribbons for that broom we jump, mourn for me but a little, then set your mind to figuring on how you gonna stay warm when winter come. And then this is her voice. She gets the last word. This is called Real Cost. York's enslaved wife. Somewhere out there, he learned to touch me like I'm a woman, and not just some woman, me. In our marriage bed, he seemed as interested in pleasing me as he be in spilling himself. I knew he'd come back changed when new words fall out his mouth like love and freedom and manhood. And there come a look in his eye like he owned all three, free and clear, and don't need no papers to prove it. But it scared me because I seen that look in many a black eye before white hammers nailed it shut or left it frozen open and swinging to teach the rest what anything that smelled like courage cost. I have no doubt he'd give his life to stay with me. So I don't tell him, Massa taking me back down south. I just kiss him soft to sleep and stare at him long enough to call up his face when I gets old and thankful he still be breathing somewhere when winter come. So those two lines give that collection the title, When Winter Come. And I'll take a break there and skip forward a couple of 100 years to another gentleman, important historical figure at least, Medgar Evers. And many of you know that Medgar Evers was a civil rights activist who was assassinated in his own driveway by Byron Daley Beckwith. And Medgar's major activity was investigating horrendous crimes against people of color in Mississippi and trying to get people registered to vote to regain and understand, or to gain and understand their political power that they had in the numbers. But a lot of people were working against that, and Daley Beckwith was representative of those people. I'm going to open this with a poem in Daley Beckwith's voice, and you can hear the difference. And to preface this particular poem, and I'll talk about and share some poems from his wife's point of view, so it still stays in this space of husbands and wives. Daley Beckwith dared to respond to a question about how difficult it was to commit the assassination. And he said it was no more difficult than the pain our women endure when they give birth to our children. So he compared taking a life with giving life and was comfortable doing so. So this first poem I'm going to read is actually in the middle of the book, and it's called Afterbirth. And I think it does a decent job characterizing his psychological state and mindset and attitude about people like Medgar Evers. Afterbirth, Byron Daley Beckwith. Like them, a man can conceive an idea, an event, a moment so clearly he can name it even before it breathes. We both can carry a thing around inside for only so long, and no matter how small it starts out, it can swell and get so heavy our backs hurt and we can't find comfort enough to sleep at night. All we can think about is the relief that waits at the end. When it was finally time, it was painless. It was the most natural thing I'd ever done. I just closed my eyes and squeezed, then opened them, and there he was, just laying there, still covered with blood, but already trying to crawl. I must admit, like any proud parent, I was afraid at first, afraid he'd live, afraid he'd die too soon. Funny how life and death is a whole lot of pushing and pulling, holding and seeking breath. A whole world turned upside down until somebody screams. Hopefully you can feel the darkness that comes out of the energy from that particular speaker. And I'll skip to one of the women behind that energy. Responding to a question from the class earlier today about how I felt about Willie and to what degree she was complicit in his activities. I always say that the fact that she divorced him and left him a second time proved that there was a line that she didn't cross, that she was opposed to. But at the same time, it was her husband. She was loyal, and in her own way that made sense to them, she loved him. And you might hear it in this poem called Fireproof, which is in the voice of Willie de la Beckwith. He would come home from evening rallies and secret meetings, so in love with me, I could never see nothing wrong with what he did with his hands. I just pretended I didn't know what gunpowder smelled like or why he kept his rifles so clean. If he walked through that door and said, "Willie, burn these clothes," I piled them on the coals and stirred the fire. I listened to the music twixt a crackle and calm as we danced. And while the ashes gathered around their own kind in the bottom of the grate, I'd watch the embers glow like our bedroom did. Now, I ain't saying he was right or wrong. He often confused hatred with desire. But if you ain't never set a man on fire, felt him explode inside you, then die in your arms, honey, you got no idea what I'm talking about. And like many poems in this collection, they're paired together. And following this poem about a woman referring to her husband is another poem where a woman talks to her husband. In this case, it's Myrlie Evers, the widow, talking about her husband. But the thing they have in common is they're referencing music and the bedroom and their intimacy, but it's a whole different energy level. This is called listening to music. Myrlie Evers. The right song, slow dancing through the air at the end of a long day full of kids and no husband, can not only set the tone, but put the sound of yesterday back in the air. Smokey Robinson and the Miracles crooned all the sweet words that his eyes whispered across the door frame when he finally came home. But more often than not, it was Sam Cooke and Ray Charles or Bobby Blue Bland taking turns in my ears, reminding me how much I love that man, no matter how mad or lonely I might have felt. The right song was like a Kodak brownie of us cuddling, or an atlas mapping out all of our rough spots and the ways around them. After sweet talking him out of his suit and tie, after he unloaded the day's burdens, we melted together in the dark beneath the covers and the crackle of the radio. The sound of my guys singing backup and Megger's jackhammer heart finally slowing to match our leaky faucet. As he fell asleep in my arms, completing the soundtrack for a perfect night. So both of those women love their husbands, and I don't think you can compare loves. You know, it either is or it isn't. I want to share two more poems from this collection, and another one in Myrlie Evers' voice, because having introduced these two women to you, I think it's only fair to imagine what would they say to each other. And I'm going to read a poem that imagines Myrlie Evers speaking to both the first and the second wife, who were at the trial every day. He had 3 trials, and there was always a wife sitting behind him, loyal, to the very end, in spite of the results, and in spite of his admitted guilt. This is called Sorority Meeting. Myrlie Evers speaks to Willie and Thelma de la Beckwith. My faith urges me to love you. My stomach begs me to not. All I know is that day made us sisters somehow. After long nervous nights and trials on end, we are bound together in this unholy sorority of misery. I think about you every time I run my hands across the echoes in the hollows of my sheets. They seem loudest just before I wake. I open my eyes every morning, half expecting Megger to be there. Then I think about you, and your eyes always snatch me back. Your eyes won't let me forget. We are sorority sisters now, with a gut-wrenching country ballad for a sweetheart song, tired funeral and courtroom clothes for colors, and secrets we would take to our graves. I was forced to sleep night after night after night with a ghost. You chose to sleep with a killer. We all pledged our love, crossed our hearts, and swallowed oaths before being initiated with a bullet. And to close this section, I'm going to share a poem in the voice of that bullet. And the details are taken straight from the court transcripts. It's called 1/3 of 180 grams of lead, which is what the bullet fragment weighed when they found it, after it passed through his body, went into the house, and landed in the kitchen. 1/3 of 180 grams of lead, the bullet. Both of them were history, even before one pulled the trigger. Before I rocketed through the smoking barrel hidden in the honeysuckle. Before I tore through a man's back, shattered his family, a window, and tore through an inner wall. Before I bounced off a refrigerator and a coffee pot. Before I landed at my destined place in history, next to a watermelon. What was cruel was the irony, not the melon, not the man falling in slow motion, but the man squinting through the crosshairs, reducing the justice system to a small circle, praying that he not miss, then sending me to deliver a message, as if the woman screaming in the dark or the children crying at her feet could ever believe a bullet was small enough to hate. Thank you. I'm going to read two more poems that I referenced that are tied back to the Lewis and Clark expedition. But the difference in this third story is that it tries to imagine that 10 years after the expedition is over, York makes a decision to return west, where he knows there's a family waiting for him. And because I knew that when I was writing this, that it was going to be made into a film, if they were good enough, I tried to really think cinematically when I thought about the individual poems, and to retell the story. And one of the things that was part of the history that some historians refuse to admit or talk about is the fact that the expedition members, there are 42 of them, all the way out and back, they had intimate relations with Native American women. Sometimes they traded for sexual favors. There's a case where one traded a cigar box, for a woman. In other cases, it was, I'm imagining, mutually consented, and sometimes I imagine it could have been even rape. But some historians argue that it didn't happen, that there was no sexual relation. But 9 months after they passed through, there were all these red-headed babies and multiracial babies that never existed before. And in the journals, they admitted that the men were being treated for venereal disease several times during the expedition. If you look at the facts, I think it's kind of obvious. One of the things they do talk about is that York was invited to have sexual relations with some of the maidens in some of the tribes because the Native Americans would see York and think he was so special, they wanted to keep some of him in their tribe. And they would arrange these private encounters and then guard the door so that nobody else would come in, believing it to be a sacred moment. So I tried to imagine in the third story, what it would be like for York to return, 10 plus years later, and he encounters one of his own children in one of these villages. So I'm going to read a poem, one of two poems in this new selection, called Crow Daughter's Mystery is Solved. And it tries to imagine cinematically what that experience might be like. And this is the Crow Daughter speaking. I never believed the story that my mother sat too close to the fire while I swam in her stomach. That coyote tricked her into looking up at the sky when the moon blocked out the sun. That a raven's dropping touched her swollen belly. Or that she ate too much camas, blackberries, and meat that had fallen in the fire. After Buffalo, who walked like man, stood up from across the fire he shared with my mother, and I saw his big hands and feet, my same nose, and listened to all the things he said to her with only his eyes, I quickly understood that the part of me that is a lie is all black and buffalo, a truth to be whispered only between women. The poem that I didn't read before this introduces that situation, and when York encounters that young lady, he's introduced to her as one of the daughters of the chief, and the chief and the mother are sitting side by side across the fire from York, and he can't really acknowledge that they have past relations because the chief thinks that's his daughter. So imagine the tension in that situation. and what happens with just facial expressions, and the daughter watching everybody's face and figuring out that, so that's what I imagine it looks like on the screen. And I'll close and open up an opportunity for Q&A with a poem that represents the broader part of the collection. Because the film is being shot in IMAX and is mostly being shot with a man alone in the wilderness, I thought a lot about what it would sound like and what you wouldn't hear and how important a sound is. And with the exception of being in the alone and hearing a hawk screech, in this third collection, York hears things that remind him of things in his past. So he has all these flashbacks that take him back to the plantation or some other experience where there was sound. So sound enters in the story through flashback and memory. And I'll close with this poem that's called Music as Medicine, and then entertain your questions. And this is York talking. And it opens with an epigraph from Sun Ra, who says, "A lot of people are walking around like empty shells. If they get some music in themselves, they won't be empty. They'll have some sound bodies." Music as medicine. York. Listening to crickets and other crawling things, find a part in the night song. Put me in mind of Sundays in the quarter and how my people sitting around and feeling empty might slowly gather together in the space of each other's breath to sing. How they always build a song that might start with a steady hand on a thigh, a heavy foot, or a solid stick setting down a heartbeat that everybody can lean into with their eyes closed before stacking other sounds right on top of it. Might be a well-timed clap or moan. Might be a rattling sound of a mess of dry beans or corn in a wooden bowl. Any kind of size wood on wood can speak truth, can scratch, click, or clack. Anything under the right hand can say doom doom, can say out loud how you really feel. And when that song starts rising, everybody at every age can't help but join in. Mothers rocking babies and humming, old folks nodding heads, young feet kicking up their heels and toes in the dirt or just dragging them to the music our lives together make. As it rises and rising, to everybody who felt empty, now feel full. Thank you. Sure. I'm responsible for a word that's in the dictionary called Appalachia. There's a book back there. My first collection of poems is called Appalachia. And by itself, it immediately forces Africa and Appalachia together in the same space, which for most people challenges what you believe or know about the region. A lot of people have accepted this idea that the region is 100% white without knowing much about the region. And the truth is, Appalachia is 13 states, parts of 13 states that extend from northern Mississippi to southern New York State. It includes Birmingham, Alabama, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So if you know anything about those spaces, you know that there are people of color there. In that same region, there are significant individuals that are part of African American history, including the father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson, is from Appalachia. Nina Simone, Roberta Flack, Bill Withers, Jesse Owens is from Appalachia. Booker T. Washington is from Appalachia. If you keep running down these names, you get a whole list of people that actually challenge this notion of these negative caricatures and stereotypes of the region that give you everything from the movie Deliverance or Beverly Hillbillies or Dukes of Hazzard, because you don't see people of color in those representations of the region. So the work I've done for 25 years in the region has been to challenge that notion, to remind people that what they may believe may not be true, and hopefully force a redefinition or interrogation of how that came to be. People know about Negro League baseball, but don't know that many of those teams were a product of co-camps, and co-camps were mostly in Appalachia. So the history has been divided, presented to us in a divided way. Unfortunately, so much so that even today you could sell this idea that West Virginia is all white, and it's not. That I remember going to Washington State and doing a college presentation on a college campus, and the first question was, are there other black people in Kentucky? I was so floored by the question. I start counting. I said, well, there's my mom and dad, and one of 11, I guess, and they actually thought I was going to count, up to 22 and say, that's it, no, 21 more plus me. But I think it has more to do with how mass media has shaped the region. No movie has done more damage to the region than the movie Deliverance. And there are a lot of people old enough to know that movie. People whistle that banjo tune from the movie, and it means a whole list of things that are both psychological and emotional for people. The first season of Justified, which was on HBO, continued that kind of myth that is an all-white space, received criticism, and then introduced people of color in the second season. But that's the long answer to that question. Thank you. Okay. I'll say what I can say about it. There's a clause in the contract that almost mutes me, but if any of you have seen the Beyonce's short film called Lemonade, on the Lemonade soundtrack, the filmmaker, Khalil Joseph, is responsible for most of that. Some of it he's not responsible for, but the original, we saw the director's cut in Idaho at a meeting with him last summer. He's a filmmaker that purchased the third collection that's making it into a feature film. We spent last summer in pre-production in Idaho, Montana, and Oregon looking for places to shoot. Getting permission from the Nez Perce Nation, the elders who agreed to not just endorse the movie, but to provide people and places. There are a lot of horses and wolves in this version, and we were, trying to find animal wranglers and people to make costumes. And we found a young woman who would be that Crow daughter. We were at a powwow, and this beautiful young lady was coming around the floor, almost like she was floating, and had on the most beautiful attire. It's mostly blue and a lot of handmade artistry. And I looked up, and everybody were focused on her because she was so stunning, including the filmmaker who was sitting in front of us. And he turned around and said, "I need a poem about her." And he went down and introduced himself afterwards. And it'll be amazing to actually watch the film when it's all done and to see her on the screen playing that particular role where she doesn't even speak. She basically just sits there and watches this interaction between her parents and her supposed father, and come to this realization that those things about her color were all lies. That she's this man's daughter, but nobody ever told her that. So it's that's just a little piece of it. His work is available online. If you is it Into the Quiet Comes? What's that? Until the Quiet Comes. If you want to know about his work, just Google Until the Quiet Comes, Khalil Joseph, K-A-H-I-L, Joseph, and you will get to see a short film that won a bunch of awards at Sundance, and you get to see the quality of his work. And it was the strength of that film that made me write the third collection, because when he called me the first time and asked about the third book, I said, "There's no third book. It's already been said. It's done." And he said, "Can I send you something?" He must have known it was that good, and it is. And after I watched it, I said, I would do anything to be connected to this man's work. But hopefully, the plan is to start shooting in late August and go through November so that he can get 3 seasons, summer, fall, and winter. And editing takes forever, but we're looking at a film that may come out at the end of 2018 or early 2019. At about the same time, that third book will also be released in conjunction with the film. talk for 2 hours about the very same thing. For me, we talk about, in the introduction, I even talked about the Appalachian aesthetic is to basically to give voice to the muted, the powerless, the folks who have been left out of history. I'm attracted to voices that have been silenced or have been afraid to speak. I have a very strong interest in history, but I'm always torn by what's considered history or what's presented as history, and sometimes it's just somebody's opinion. But once it's labeled history, people say it's true, even though it could just be his story as opposed to history. So the York story for me initially came out of embarrassment. I had degrees, and I taught Kentucky African-American history, and I never said the man's name, never said York to any audience, any classroom, and I was embarrassed that I didn't know his story. But once I understood that, his story had kind of been buried, not just buried in history, but had been removed. There were history books that came out at the end of the 1800s that talked about York's true contribution, but right about the same time as post-Reconstruction, when all those original black congressmen and senators were disappeared, and Jim Crow and all the new laws to disempower newly enfranchised former slaves, there was new history about York that rewrote his contribution and almost made him a buffoon or a sexual predator in some books, which was unfortunate but consistent with what else was happening during that time period in America. So, discovering all that, really made me interested in telling his story partly because he lived in Kentucky. His wife lived in Kentucky. They probably had kids, but there's no written evidence of who they were or how many they were or where they were at. And a part of me imagines, on some of those early morning writings that, maybe I'm a descendant, myself. I lived in the same space. But not knowing that information and trying to correct history, which is different than revisionist history. It's adding another point of view. I think that my mother always said, there's two sides to every story, and then there's the truth. And the truth represents all the combined points of view. So as I wrote these historical collections of poetry, I learned that the more people telling the story, the closer to the truth we could get as an audience. By the time the sequel came out, there are 12 or 13 speakers as opposed to one. So you can surround the truth in such a way that everybody's heard from, and there's no doubt about what the truth is, or there's little doubt or less doubt about what the truth is. Otherwise, it's one person's opinion. You want more than that? Is that? But if those projects include interviewing people and telling their stories in some written form or recorded or video, more power to you. Please do that. We were encouraging students today to interview the oldest members of their family. Just turn the recorder on and let them talk. You don't have to ask them questions, but they represent so much history and family stories that when they're gone, those stories go with them. So we should have some obligation or feel obligated to capture those stories, if not for ourselves, to pass them on to our kids and our kids' kids. Imagine the gift of pushing a button and you get to hear your great-great-great-grandparent tell you about their life and talk to you, or if it's on video that you can see their face and see that you guys are related, and know that little, curl on the front of your head is 5 generations old or something. That kind of warm connection to your ancestry, I think is important. I think it's something kind of lost in all this new technology, but we're better technology, but we're not getting smarter. Where's the genealogy app that's on Facebook? That's free. The free genealogy app. That's even better. You can click on a name, and you get property records and marriage certificates and death certificates, and you get the census from 1880 that just does all the work for you, because most apps do that. You just push a button. Somebody invent that and then give it away. Now, you can make money off of it. I'd pay for it. Well, I'll write about my opinion. There are two versions of the end of York's life. Consider the comments I made earlier about history. According to history, because it was written down, when William Clark died on his deathbed, he was asked, whatever happened to York? And he said that old York wasn't happy being a free man, that he was on the way back to be his slave again. Swallow that. When he died of the cholera in the mountains of Tennessee. Native Americans say that York came back out west and lived to be a very old man. I only like one of those stories. And my third book is about one of those stories. And it's kind of hard to imagine that a man who, had been a slave for 45 years of his life had experienced the kind of freedom and almost worship status, among Native Americans for those 3 years, given a choice, would say, I'd rather be a slave. It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, I can imagine Clark, trying to worry about his legacy, because people critiqued him, criticized him, because he promised to free York immediately upon the return from the expedition, because he made so many contributions. And they were parading around the country, giving speeches, and getting everybody in the party except York got a huge sum of money and a big chunk of land. Not York, but he had promised York his freedom for his contributions. Well, he freed him 10 years later. So I imagine part of that version of what happened to York was to save face for himself, for him to still feel superior in some way. But I'm rather taken by the idea of him going back out west. I mean, there's something about being out west. During the research, my son was 13, 14, and 15, during research trips, and we spent summers in the great out west and time on the Nez Perce Reservation. In fact, we spent the first 2 summers with them. They didn't even tell us that we were eating dinner and lunch. Everybody we'd eaten with officially were a descendant of York. They didn't tell us until the 3rd summer we came back. And then it was then that they gave me a copy of the transcribed oral history that talked about York in their oral history, talked about York's romance with the chief's daughter, and York's son that she produced, whose name was also York. And then said, remember, so-and-so on day 1 and day 2, those are all descendants of York. And I wondered why they looked like my own grandchildren, And it's, it's considered an honorable situation to be a descendant of York in the tribe. I mean, it's a beautiful space. They're beautiful people. And I'm excited to be able to be part of a film now that will be made, largely on the reservation and in the surrounding areas. Thank you for your patience and attendance and your appreciation of literature and poets. Good night.